Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, 6 Effective Strategies to Approach Your Mobile Testing. My name is Brent Jenkins, Marketing Manager here at Checkpoint Technologies, and I will be your moderator. Joining me today is our President and Co-Founder, Bob Cruz, as well as the President of Mobile Labs, Dan McFall. Bob, let's start with you. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. As Brent mentioned, my name is Bob Cruz, President and Co-Founder of Checkpoint Technologies. I've been in IT for about 29 years now, and for about the past probably 18, I've been very focused on quality assurance and software testing as well as DevOps. I'm very excited about today's presentation, in which we're going to share the challenges of mobile testing and hopefully give you some good insight and ideas to ponder. And I'm very excited to be with my co-presenter, Dan McFall. Dan, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. This is Dan McFall. I'm the President of Mobile Labs. Not quite as long a storied career as Bob, but I have about 20 years in software and IT. I've spent the last 5 with Mobile Labs, focused very specifically on quality and process improvements around mobile application development and testing. I'm really looking forward to our presentation to you today.
Great. Thanks, guys. So, a little bit about us before we get started. Checkpoint Technologies provides expert services and best-of-breed software solutions for quality assurance and software testing, specifically when it comes to functional, performance, and application security testing. What we do is we enable organizations to deliver higher quality applications to market faster. We started in January of 2003, and we're headquartered in sunny Tampa, Florida. We are proud partners with Mobile Labs, who obviously we're doing the webinar with today, along with Atlassian, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, QA Symphony, Ranorex, and Zephyr, all best-of-breed solutions. We are also an HPE authorized software support and certified training partner. Along with that, we're also affiliated with QAI Worldwide. QAI stands for Quality Assurance Institute. And if you ever need training courses on things like the essentials in software testing or even mobile application testing and more, we can certainly provide that to you in our training center here, remotely, or even at your organization. So as far as some of the professional services that we provide, there's staff augmentation. So if you need manual, automatic, or automation or performance testing resources to be a part of your team, long or short term, whether on-site or remote, we can certainly provide that to you. We also provide consulting and assessments, so anything from handling upgrades to installation configurations, QA process or test assessments, audits, and more. Next, there's our version of onshoring, where we can house a team for you right here in our headquarters in Tampa, Florida. We also provide education, so structured classroom training and tailored mentoring, where we will go on-site in your environment and educate your team where real work actually gets done. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dan McFall to tell you a little bit about Mobile Labs. Dan?
Thanks, Brent. So Mobile Labs was founded at the tail end of 2011. Our headquarters, where I'm speaking to you from today, is here in Atlanta, Georgia. We have part of our own QA services team, but a big portion of our customer service team based out of an office in Noida, India. We service really organizations throughout the world. Primarily, we're a U.S. business with the majority of our customers in the U.S., but we have customers in Europe and Australia, and even in the Middle East. So our primary solution that we provide to the marketplace is in providing some of the things that we'll talk about in more specifics later in the webinar as part of your strategy, but we are a provider of device cloud technology, be it internal or external, off-premise or hosted. We provide to you the ability to virtualize mobile devices that can then be shared as a common resource between your development organizations, your QA organizations, your customer service organizations, et cetera. Today we'll be heavily focused on the quality teams, but we'll talk a little bit about why you need a device cloud. Once again, that cloud can be any place that you need it, either behind your firewall, completely on premise, as in the full appliance approach you see here on the right, or fully in a certified hosted facility where we'll manage access to the devices, the upkeep of the devices, etc. You're getting the exact same technology in either deployment model. It just really depends on where you are and where you need to be. We are a provider of cloud technologies. Back to you, Brent.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks, Dan. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a live webinar, but it is being recorded, so everyone that has registered or attended today will receive a link to that recording within 24 hours. And then we want to encourage everybody to ask questions at any point throughout the webinar on the questions panel. As you can see on the right, we're using GoToWebinar, so look for the questions, type it in, select enter. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, and if we don't get to your question during that Q&A session or throughout the webinar, we will be following up with answers to everybody's questions within about a week and a half or so from this webinar.
And the other thing I would add here in that questions panel that you can use it for is if Dan or I happen to make a joke, even if it's a bad one, please feel free to type in the more socially acceptable LOL or haha. That would really help boost our ego, everybody.
Yeah, I would prefer you use all caps as well to make it emphasize you're really laughing out loud. So with that, we're going to kick off the presentation. We'll start out with strategy number 1, which I'm going to hand over to Bob, which is test prioritization.
So obviously, today's webinar, we are very focused on mobile testing and mobile application testing. You're going to see throughout today's webinar that there are a number of different similarities and commonalities with any type of testing. And then you're going to see some that are very unique considerations in regard to mobile testing and mobile application testing. So one thing I wanted to chat about is, well, how do you prioritize what it is that you want to test? And prioritization for as many organizations as I've consulted with and for, it's amazing how many organizations do not really prioritize their testing efforts. And one of the things I always try to emphasize is, you know, there's a lot to test, and a lot of times there's too much to test. So if you go to your leadership and they ask you, have you tested everything, and you say no, well, one thing that makes them feel a little bit better is if you can say, well, no, but we've been at least able to test and validate all of our high priority functionality initiatives, et cetera. So there are a lot of different ways that you can prioritize. So you can, obviously, it's going to depend largely on your business, your applications. What is it that your testing objectives are? What kind of target dates are you dealing with? What does the application itself do? What is it used for? And another important consideration, especially in the world of mobile application testing, is the demographic of users. So it's really interesting in that a lot of organizations will make it a priority to validate against Apple or iOS, if you will. And yet Samsung is the most popular in 92 of 230 different countries. In India, the top phones, if you will, the top smart devices are Nokia and Samsung, with Apple being less than 5%. So there are a lot of different things that you have to look at when it comes to the demographics, as well as the age range. You know, I'm an old guy, I'll admit it, and without a doubt, I use my smart devices in a much different way than my younger children or my grandchildren do. What are your testing objectives? I mentioned that before, that you've got to take a look at that. And then something I always love, and I highly encourage organizations to do, is to take a look at the risk analysis. Identify and evaluate the impact and the likelihood of various risk throughout your application and prioritize what to test based off of the risk score.
Perfect. Great. Thanks, Bob. So moving on to strategy number 2, set up a device cloud. I'm going to hand this one over to Dan.
Thanks, Brent. So I think, Bob just talked about, so we've prioritized, right? And we look at the fact that in part of that priority, one of the things he mentioned is talking about, device platforms and which device platforms do we need, what do we use them for, what kind of testing are we going to prioritize them for, et cetera, et cetera. And I think most people, on this discussion are aware that with implementation of things like Agile and all of those types of things, one of the challenges that we see is we've had this growing constituency of people who work on our product who are interconnected. And, web technologies allowed us to streamline those processes via virtualization and other things, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And what that means is that the constituency of people who need common resources has really grown. And what's happened in mobile, though, is that they need a common repository of the exact same assets. So whether you have development teams using their IDEs, Android Studio, Xcode, or some application development platform like Xamarin or Kony, or engineering and deployment teams, or testing teams of all kinds, they're coming in and looking for that same common asset. Next slide, please. And why is that? Is I was already talking about this, the connected approach, right? So in the advent of virtualization is really what led to the ability to move with these agile DevOps rapid deployment type processes, because we started to develop so much control over, maybe I deploy brand new into production, but production just means 5% of production or 25% of production. I do certain sets of servers, whatever else. It became very easy to roll back, move forward. So all of those types of things became very, very popular, very efficient, allowed us to do more with smaller teams, allowed us to communicate more easily, et cetera. But in mobility, all of that breaks. And the reason all of that breaks is because in mobility, we are back to single points of interactivity, and that is the mobile device itself. Whether I need iPhones, iPads, Samsung tablets, Samsung phones, Kindle Fires, even special purpose-built devices that are running Android, all of those things become this single point of access that I need that have to be shared. So in mobility, I have to connect those devices into a cloud-based environment if I'm going to get the economies of scale that I get out of Agile. And I think, some of that leads to then asking the question still, well, do I really need real devices? And, we're getting close to a point that we've moved past this question within the marketplace. I've been doing this for 5 years now. We still got hit with it a whole lot more. As a vendor of somebody who gives you device clouds, sometimes I do feel like, hey, I'm the fox in the chicken coop on this. But really, it comes from the vendors of the software platforms themselves, whether it's Apple or Google. In their documentation about the state of the art, they'll remind you that there are things that emulators and simulators don't do that real devices do. There's performance variances, there's GPS, there's batteries within them if you're starting to look at battery testing, and all of those types of technical elements really matter. But the fact of the matter is, your customers don't use simulators or emulators. So I always found it kind of interesting that lots of times we used to have conversations back when instrumentation was so popular, before Apple and Google opened up the developer tools to be able to remote control their devices in valid ways, and we had to use instruments. That lots of people would say, well, my customers don't use instruments. Well, your customers also don't use simulators or emulators. So the fact of the matter is the whole purpose here of our test environments is to start to recreate the customer experience. Then ultimately your customers are on some type of physical device, and the experience that they have and the test cases that you want to validate are tied to those physical devices, be it functional or performance. So ultimately that drives us back to a repository of real devices. We have to be able to share those devices across a multitude of functional requirements, business functional requirements, be it, once again, developers, performance engineers, functional test engineers, user experience testers, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way that you're going to really be able to solve that problem in an efficient digital manner is with the device cloud.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. So, moving on. Strategy number 3, test plan structure. This one goes over to Bob.
All right. Thanks, Brent. So, when it comes to a test plan structure, I mean, let's ask ourselves for a moment, why is it so important? And the fact of the matter is, I'm sure that everybody joining us for the webinar is very experienced and understands that when you're organized, it just makes it so much easier to find information, enter information, extract information, and track the progress of your testing effort. So that's why it's so very important to have an organized, structured test plan. As long as you are organized or you have a structure that makes sense, then I would venture to say there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to structure a test plan. There is a number of different ways that you can do it. If you're utilizing a risk-based approach, you can go so far as to just, create your folder structure, if you will, where you're going to store your test cases, starting off with the high risk, mid-level risk, low risk, etc. Or you could even start to create a structure where it's based on the types of mobile testing that you might be doing. So you might have a folder based on where you're testing for device features. So you've got a folder where you've got your different test cases focused on size, on temperature, etc. You might have folders where it's more mobile specific testing. So where you're talking about the different types of inputs, whether it's gestures, data entry, and then under each of these folders, again, you're going to have your test cases defined, and it might include orientation, user interface, OS guidelines, etc. And then you might even have a folder for field testing. So that's one way to do it if you want to look at types of mobile testing. If you want to develop a structure based on categories within the mobile ecosystem, then you could build your structure based off networks, manufacturers, platform OS, or even devices, or the most common being application and application functionality. So maybe you have some folders based on functional, installation test cases, security, performance and stress, and so on. And then another option would be network stack protocols. So perhaps you have your folder structures based on the application layer, the transport layer, internet layer, and link layer. So these are just a few ideas that you could consider. Again, there's not necessarily anything that's right or wrong, and you may even have some ideas of your own. Another thing that you could always look at is, do we want to develop a plan, a structure based on our approach? So maybe we're utilizing an agile approach. Maybe we're using requirements-based testing. Maybe it's going to be based on mobile application demographics, where we've got our different test cases based on the ages of our users, the geographic location of our users. So again, a lot of different options when it comes to a test plan structure. The key thing I would want to emphasize is that you want to be organized to make it so much easier to track the progress of your testing initiative, to better enter, modify, and find your testing assets and other data.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bob. So, strategy number 4, implementing automated testing. Dan, this one goes to you.
Thanks, Brent. So it's really key in mobile that automation becomes an important part of, we've kind of gone through test prioritization and we have a test plan. You're going to need automation at some point in time to keep up with, any kind of robust, broadly deployed mobile application. But I want to take a moment, because that was a bit of an all or nothing kind of statement, and say that does not mean that manual testing is going to go away. Manual testing is not important. Manual testing is in some way something that is dying. It's really a hand-in-hand type solution. For one, anything that we're going to automate should have been done manually the first time. I mean, that's sort of testing 101. 2, mobility actually presents some test cases that, for a variety of reasons, might not make sense to ever automate, whether it's things around maybe accelerometer testing, so shaking the device regularly, things of that nature still make sense, even not just remote manual testing, but even in-hand manual testing. But the reason, and I usually have a chart for this, but decided not to put it in this because it would go too deeply, so I'll sort of walk through it. Automation presents itself as valid in mobility much sooner and gives a stronger return on investment and test case coverage capability much sooner in mobility, and that is because of the notions of variance, some of the things that we talked about in test case prioritization. So if you have a consumer-facing application or a customer-facing application that's going to be deployed both iOS and Android, the ecosystem of devices can be pretty broad. And especially in the Android ecosystem, that means then a pretty broad OS level, pretty broad level of operating systems that need to be covered, that need to be tested on. And if you start looking at that, then the bang for the buck, if you will, of automation comes a lot sooner than it did even in web technologies, right? If you have a simple login script that you're trying to test and you want to get coverage maybe on websites, there's 3 OS levels against 3 different versions of browsers, you need to go through and run that test case 9 times to get your regression coverage. Well, if you move into mobile and you have a couple different flavors of iOS, several different device types, tablets and phones, different form factors, you add Android, you're now all of a sudden looking at that test case hundreds of times that need to be run just to get through the simple, does my login work, or what happens when I enter the incorrect password. So automation really gives you coverage, and automation allows the fact that manual engineers who can do contextual-based testing and all of those things aren't doing something as boring as just typing the password into forms over and over again. So that's why automation tends to present itself in mobility as something that makes sense a lot earlier in the life cycle of your application. Next slide, please. But then on top of that, you start running into interesting challenges, right? So I've covered device and operating system variety and diversity. That covers why we need to automate. But mobility also, because of the fact that a lot of legacy systems for web were sort of late to also covering mobility, it's introduced a lot of tool diversity, both open source and commercial. I'll kind of go into some of the more common frameworks that we see people working with in our customer base. But there's also a lot of different types of testing, and automation in mobile also introduces complexity around what I call the collisions of different types of testing. So, for example, is it a functional test or a performance test when I want to see what happens in my application if I change network conditions? Well, it's a little bit of both, right? So how does my application function when I suddenly move from a high-speed LTE network to an edge network? That's a functional problem and a performance problem. So you start to see a confluence of different requirements which introduce complexity, and it's technical complexity. So those things also present themselves well for automation because you have complete control over what you're doing in the environment when things happen. You can insert the change in network state into your test case at exactly the right time, at exactly the right step in the process, so you can do those more complicated types of testing. I talked a little bit about the volume that you need that's driven by the device and operating system variety, and the fact that regression, then when a new OS level comes out or you have a new version of your application, you can see why automation really starts to present itself as something that you need. And then there is, of course, always the automation specialist and the skill set that you have there in mobility. Mobile architectures are a little bit different. Even if you're doing just a responsive website, so you're looking for kind of that one pane of glass sort of approach, whether I'm on desktop web, mobile web for phone, mobile web for tablet, the underlying architectures there are different, especially as these new frameworks for things like React Native that allow you to put native application controls on web pages. All of those types of things are pretty complex. And once again, the ability to automate those things really starts to simplify your test case coverage. Just to kind of spend a minute so that you know what's sort of out there, what we're seeing in the world of tools, in test tool diversity. As we keep seeing, the open source revolution is definitely taking over within the enterprise around automation frameworks, especially in mobile. We talk a little bit here about Calabash, the Cucumber framework, even things like Cylindroid. I think the biggest thing we see that's really happening in mobility is around Appium. It is sponsored by the same folks who did the Selenium project. There's a lot of similar look and feel and capability there. Lots of people have experienced Selenium automation engineers. Appium is still different because of those architectural differences. So you'll be shocked to find we have people who are shocked by trying to take some Selenium scripts, port them directly to Appium, and they run into challenges. A simple example of that is you can tab it in web pages. You can't tab on mobile devices. 3 years ago, that used to crash the Appium server if you actually send key tab. Now it has better error handling for those types of things. But these are things that you have to think about when you go into mobile automation. And then there are still solutions that come directly from the OS provider. So you see the Xcode symbol there. There's XCUI test from Apple. It's a great place to automate your unit tests as you're writing them. And Android Studio provides the Espresso framework. Same thing. Those ship for free with the IDEs that you use. So, there's a variety of tooling that is available to you that fits your skill set, that fits your need, that fits your team's need. And we recommend that folks take a look at them because they are free. In the commercial space, there are, an excellent number of commercial or quote-unquote off-the-shelf software solutions. And I think one of the things I wanted to take this opportunity to say is that because of Agile, because of the different teams and the different skill sets, you don't have to go with a one-size-fits-all automation strategy. If your development and SDET teams like Appium, that's fantastic. But what if your user acceptance testing team doesn't have really the requisite deep level developer skill sets required to write scripts in those languages? Well, there are next generation off the shelf commercial software solutions that allow you to keep running automation that kind of bring to bear the promise of record and play from all those years ago. Things like Ranorex or Eggplant from Test Plant, or allow you to do really, really complex scripting in complex systems, but actually not have to write code like the Tosca suite from Tricentis. New players like TestGrid, all of those types of folks. So, and the thing to think about is, unlike some of the legacy automation and quality suites, the cost is not nearly as prohibitive. So if you're looking maybe for some folks who aren't as technically enabled to come in and automate the entire end-to-end process, or want to be able to do kind of user tests, things of that nature, there are a lot of really excellent, viable commercial automation products out there and we can, we recommend that you look into those and, and then work with your valued services partners to, like Checkpoint, to help make them work for you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dan. So moving on, strategy number 5, test execution. Bob?
So, Dan made some just outstanding points in regard to test automation, and I'm going to touch upon that some more in just a moment. But when you're looking at test execution, you've got to take a look at, are we executing manually or are we utilizing automation? And from a manual perspective, you've got to ask yourself, all right, when it comes to the individual executing this test, who is testing it? Who's testing what, when, and how, and on what devices? And all of that should be documented in your test plan. You've got to look at device readiness. And, we haven't really discussed that up until this point, but one of the reasons we, Checkpoint Technologies, have partnered with Mobile Labs is we're just a huge proponent of their solutions. And when it comes to device readiness, you cannot have that conversation without talking about device management. So are the devices in the proper state to begin testing? Because I'd like for all of you to think about how many times have you been in a situation where your testing lab, and I know you can't see me, but I'm using the air quotes, is basically a table with 10, 20, maybe even 30 different devices scattered across that table that your testers are just grabbing to perform their mobile testing. And when it comes to device readiness, you would pick up a device and the tester has to first look at that device and do a little bit of a smoke test. Have there been any applications installed on this device that I'm not aware of that will impact my testing? Have any settings been altered? Because face it, this device has not been secured. It's been there sitting on that table in your makeshift test lab. And then the other thing that you have to ask yourself is the device even there? Because I'm sure we're all familiar with losing track of where the devices may have gone to. A well-intentioned tester may have taken it back to their desk and then thrown it in their drawer. So device readiness is key, and as part of that, device management is very, very important. And then naturally, when manually testing, you have to look at, is the application under test in the proper status to test? Has all of the code been migrated? Has all of the builds been done? Are there any patches that have had to been installed? And how are the results in regard to manual execution going to be reported? Are there standards for that in your organization? Then we can take a look at automation. So automation, a very different animal. Naturally, automation, everybody understands that the speed of automation is a huge benefit. But the other thing to truly look at is typically when you implement automation, the scope of what it is you're validating increases, and that's a good thing. So perhaps manually, I would execute with and test with 10 different data values, and that might take me manually 30 minutes to perform. Well, then I find once I've developed an automated process for that same test, I'm able to actually validate 100 different sets of data in 2 minutes. So that's why with so many organizations, I always tell people, I don't ever see the size or the effort of the test team decrease. Instead, I see the scope increase. I see a greater number of conditions validated. So now you have some other considerations that you have to look at, test data being one of them. Is the environment ready for you to execute your test? Because one of the other considerations that organizations have to take into account with test automation is, if I am going to execute automated test in a distributed fashion, so on other machines, and unattended. So the idea is I want to be able to walk away from my machine. That tester should not be forced to sit there and babysit that automated test. But if we're going to do that, that means you are leaving that device logged into that application and you are leaving it unsecured. So that's why a secure test lab becomes even more important when you are executing utilizing test automation. So just a few factors that you've got to think about. And again, that can be tied back to device management and the importance of having them secured. The other thing that you're going to look at and ask yourself is, well, what's the reason we're testing? Is it new development? So if you've got an automation framework implemented, then new development may not be a problem for you to automate if you've done it wisely. I've been performing and speaking on test automation for many years. But it's the second bullet, regression, which is widely accepted as the type of testing where you are going to realize your greatest ROI when it comes to test automation. And then you've also got to look at performance, or are you doing functional testing? And the fact of the matter is, with performance testing, I think it's widely considered that it's pretty much impossible to do adequate performance testing without utilizing test automation of some sort. So these are all things that we have to look at and make sure that if you're going to automate your test, you do so wisely. And then, as I mentioned, there is definitely a difference between the approach and strategy for manual testing as opposed to automated testing. It's very important to have procedures, guidelines, and standards in place for results reporting, metrics collecting, etc. The benefits of this is it helps you better track your progress. It helps you better identify your level of success when it comes to test automation. And the other thing too is it enables senior leadership to track the return on investment that is being realized with test automation. So again, just a few of the factors that you've got to consider in regard to test execution. So, and then you've got the different types of testing that you're going to perform. So for any of these types of testing, if you see that you've got the same actions being performed over and over again, but perhaps with different sets of data, then in all likelihood, those could very well be excellent candidates for automation. But then, even from a manual perspective, you may require a different level of skill sets from your team in order to decide who is best suited to perform these types of testing from either a manual or automated perspective. So are they performing tests for installation and the uninstall? Are they doing functional performance or security testing? What about interrupt testing? User acceptance testing. Obviously, with user acceptance testing, you want to select an individual that is more of a subject matter expert. They understand the business. They understand how the users, the end users, are using the application, using that device out in the real world. And then you've got compatibility, service, and there are many, many others that you could look at in regard to the types of testing.
Fantastic, Bob. So on to our sixth and final strategy, constant feedback, and this goes back over to Dan.
Thank you. And it actually segues really nicely from some of what Bob was just talking about. So, the point of the test execution piece is, answering the first question, the one we've been answering as quality professionals for a really long time, which is, are we ready to deploy our application, right? We've tested it with as much coverage as we can get. We've regression tested it. We've used automation suites. We've driven all of those types of things to say, yes, I have as much confidence as I can within my budget and with the time constraints we have to be able to say, yes, we're ready to deploy this application. But the thing that's become interesting as part of the DevOps revolution, the fact that we've made this cyclical, is really the ability to also ask the question, are we still ready, right? What is the information that I can get and bring back into the process to say, is it actually still functioning the way that I expected, or was there something I missed because of real-world examples, or did something from a service provider change that we didn't anticipate because we're using some kind of third-party service, et cetera, et cetera. And that really is about monitoring. So what we're first starting to monitor is like, what are we doing? So Bob already really talked about this, so I'll very briefly kind of touch on this, right? So what are the test execution reports? Where are we managing those? How do we know whether it's manual or automated, that we're getting the coverage that we want? Once again, at the bottom, here's, you know, a wide variety of popular solutions that we see in the marketplace, especially sort of those right three. We're really seeing this Atlassian push and the tools that work around Atlassian, whether it's QA Symphony or Zephyr that drive the test case management solution there. But all of those things to kind of become the source of feedback to say, are we ready? Once again, I have this dashboard that tells me I feel very good that I have given this enough test coverage with enough passes that, yes, maybe I failed some tests, but they're in weird edge cases, and we feel confident that we can deploy. But in the are we still ready world, which has become something that's been there for a while but has really modernized and become a very popular stack of technology, there's a reason that a lot of the IT IPOs and acquisitions have been in the application performance monitoring space, whether it's your App Dynamics or your New Relics or anybody like that, has become the ability to keep validating that are we ready with are we still ready in production. So how is my performance and my availability, right? We've done all those complex performance tests, but you still just don't have the confidence to say how's it going to perform in Peoria, right? So we have those types of abilities to monitor that now and look at all those types of things. Once again, did I have a problem relative to third-party providers? Maybe you're using Amazon, as we all experienced a few months back, and something happens that you're using Amazon Web Services and that went down, and all of a sudden, you know about it because Slack is down, and apparently half the world's on Slack now. So all of those types of things become about constantly monitoring that, protecting yourself, and seeing what can happen. But there's also a growing next wave of that, which becomes about, well, what are, either actively or passively monitoring our users. If you have a question within a native mobile application that said, are you willing to provide feedback, the customer is probably, the vendor is probably utilizing a library that can be inserted in the application that tracks things like crash reporting. So if you at the discrete user level experienced a problem, you're actually providing instantaneous feedback that can be fed all the way into the beginning of this process with our very first strategy, which is helping to prioritize the next case. And then, of course, we see right now a lot of 180-degree feedback, right? We have app stores, we have NPS values of tracking what are people saying about our applications and all of those types of things. We have the ability to do crowdsourced testing, who can do demographic-based testing for us and give us that type of feedback. I actually think a little bit of looking forward that there's an opportunity here to follow the Uber, Lyft, Airbnb model where there's potentially even 360 degrees of feedback. So we actually find out information about the user's environment, and they one-star your app, and you come back and go, yeah, but they're running it on an ancient device, and we warn you not to do those types of things. So yes, I understand they had a bad experience. We're working on it, but here's some of the things maybe you need to understand about the user that we had. So those types of opportunities become all about feedback and turn the concept of application lifecycle management from a left to right line into a circle, because if you think about this stuff, this all then moves back into our test case prioritization, the next level of testing, and it all becomes part of the notion of continuous testing. be it in the lab or be it in production, feedback then becomes the way that we start the process all over again.
Hey, Dan, if you don't mind, I'm going to interject with one thing here because, you know, it's obviously we've only got so much time, but something that Dan and I have not discussed is the whole Internet of Things explosion, if you will. And, you know, one of the things that I've been speaking at a lot of conferences on that, and I just find it absolutely amazing because it really gives us some unique challenges in that when you're talking about smart devices and the Internet of Things, you've got all of this data that's coming into your device from different points and or through so many other devices. And that is creating more and more unique challenges when it comes to automation, when it comes to monitoring, performance testing, and certainly functional testing as well, because we've got so many different legs that data gathers from the point where it's obtained, you know, whether it's from some sort of a sensory device on a marine animal, right on up through the actual device where it gets displayed to the user. So just to let everybody know, Dan and I are certainly not blind to the whole Internet of Things. It was just something we didn't have much more time to fully discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So that moves on to the Q&A session. We've got some great questions. We have just a little bit of time, so we'll probably take 5, maybe 6 questions, and then we'll save the rest we'll follow up with. So once again, like I mentioned at the top of the webinar, if we don't get to your question, don't worry, we will be answering all of them in a follow-up email within about a week or so from now. So let's start out here. And Bob, I think you touched on this a little bit, but the question is, what about regression tests? Do you recommend running those as automated tests?
So I don't want to give just a generalized yes, but those are certainly the test cases that I recommend you analyze first in order to identify the best candidates for automation. When you're looking at your regression test and trying to decide whether or not you should automate them, ask them, all right, will this functionality, will the requirement that we're validating, are we expecting this to be around for the next few versions? If so, it might make sense to automate. And then obviously ask yourself, well, how long does it take us to execute the test manually? But if you look at the manual execution time that it takes times the number of executions you expect to perform during the next 6 months, and then compare that to how long it will take you to actually automate that process and the execution time. If the automation time is less, then it's probably a very good candidate for automation. But regression is a great place to start.
Excellent. So Dan, I'm going to pass this one over to you since you you touched on the device cloud. This question is, do most device cloud solutions support open source testing tools?
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I think I hate to give the vendor answer here, but it sort of depends. And what I mean by that is support of open source tools can really kind of come in 2 flavors. And I do think, yeah, I'll put my sales hat on for a second. We sort of take, I think at Mobile Labs, a unique approach to this because we really try to open the devices up truly as a platform for utilization with a variety of testing tools. We supported every testing tool that was on those slides that I talked about, unencumbered. And what I mean by that is there are solutions that out there that, yes, they might have an Appium add-in or a Calabash add-in or whatever else, but those add-ins are still then tied typically to an in-house proprietary automation strategy in which there's an interface from really one automation stack to another automation stack. And that is an approach. and it's a tried and true approach, and it can work okay, but you then are still running into, like any other interface technology, challenge, architecture A talking to architecture B, and you can run into challenges with that. On the mobile lab side, we provide the ability to just open the devices up directly. So Appium functions the way that Appium functions. Calabash functions the way that Calabash functions. The commercial tools function the way the commercial tools function. And then what we've done is we add secret sauce around making them work better. So if you look at something like Appium, what we've done is we've embedded into the solution the ability to manage the Appium server directly as part of the overall solution. So you don't have to manage those anymore. We make, concurrent device runs a lot easier, all of that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're still writing an Appium script. And if you fire me, you still have Appium scripts, and they still run, and you don't lose your automation, because arbitrary vendor lock-in is just something we don't believe in. So no, not all clouds will support it in the exact same way, not in a way that we think puts the onus on us to make sure you're getting everything you need out of the cloud solution.
Great, thanks, Dan. So this next question I'm going to pass over to Bob. And just again, Dan, feel free to piggyback off any of Bob's answers and vice versa to you, Bob. But the question is, what is your recommendation for ensuring good coverage on different devices when testing a consumer-facing app?
Great question. So that would go back to when Dan and I both discussed at different times the importance of understanding the demographics that your application pertains to, if you will. I don't know if that's proper grammar or not, but it's just, that's what is so important. You've got to know your business, you've got to know the application, and you've got to know your users. Where are they located? What are their ages? How do they use the application that you're testing? How do they use the devices? And you've got to find out from leadership, what is their risk tolerance? Do you really want to end up spending time testing a scenario which only applies to 2% of all the users out there and risk not spending the time to test other functionality that applies to 98% of the users? So you've really got to find out if leadership wants to incur that risk. I think once you put it in mathematical terms to them, they will realize that that's not the case. So again, understand your application, the demographics, who are the majority of your users, and how do they use the application. I hope that helps.
Fantastic, Bob. Okay, so next question. I'm actually going to pass this over to Dan, just because, Dan, with the device cart and everything, I feel like you guys have had to have come across this question a fair amount. Do you have any tips on acquiring and managing physical devices for our mobile testing efforts?
Oh, that's a yes. We do have some tips and tricks. I think one of the things I would say is this is hard for everybody, especially in enterprises, because a lot of things anymore, being cost conscious, all of those types of things in organizations. We work with a major airline, and somebody joked with us one time, it's easier for me to buy a new 747 than it is to get an iPad. And the reason for that actually is when you start looking at companies that have 50,000 employees, that actually iPads for everybody would cost more than a 747. So we understand that. There's two ways to approach it, right? I think one of the ways is the device cloud actually helps a little bit, because it will decrease the number of devices that you need, because you're not buying, the brand new iPhone 8 times. Maybe you need 1 or 2 that can now be shared amongst teams and put together in reservations. But I think the second piece that goes along with this, and it's part of why we moved into the hosted business, is we just heard the pain. So honestly, put it on the vendors. We can help with that. It's something we do all the time. It's a place that we can help you with managing the level of the devices, rolling them in as part of the service. The tricks are they're expensive and they're only getting more expensive. Relationships, with places like Amazon and some of those also really help. But I'll be honest, we hear the pain, we feel it, and it's actually part of the reason we bundled it into the service for a lot of our customers.
Great, thanks a lot, Dan. All right, so we are starting to get a little bit of short time, so I'm gonna send one more to Bob, and then Dan, I'll give you one more as well, and then we'll follow up with everybody else, like I said, in a follow-up email. And just as a reminder to everybody that's still on, we are recording this webinar. If you didn't catch that at the beginning of the webinar, this is recorded. You will receive a link to that recording. So the question, Bob, to you is, we are trying to approach mobile testing in our organization, but we don't have the internal knowledge or skill set. Do you have any suggestions?
So great question. You have a few different options in that regard. So again, as I understand it, you're trying to approach mobile testing, but you don't have the expertise in-house at this point of time. So some of your options would be to obviously hire that expertise, talk to your HR department if you have one, identify the skill sets that you need, and then go about trying to find individuals to hire. And or another option is with your existing team, get them trained. There's a lot of great classes out there. You can certainly have training brought on site to your location. That's actually something we provide as well. And then another option that you have is to, at risk of sounding like a salesperson, but utilize consulting firms such as ours, where we could go in, help you get up and running, and at the same time provide mentoring to your team with an emphasis on knowledge transference. So those are truly your options. But it's great, it's excellent that you recognize the fact that mobile testing, mobile application testing is definitely a different animal, and you need to treat it accordingly.
Perfect. All right, final question. Over to you, Dan. Our team is exploring using Appium for automated testing. Any tips around strategy?
Yes, yeah. So I think one of the things is that we're big fans of Appium, and it's especially come a long way in the last year and a half, 2 years. And, we definitely see it picking up. I think there's a couple of tips that I will recommend to folks, and I actually covered one of these. Is one, yes, it's based on Selenium, but they're not exactly the same thing, and that's partly driven because mobile applications and mobile websites are not the same thing as desktop applications and desktop websites. So you're going to want to spend some time exploring those differences. I think the second thing to say around it is, if I were to give a tip, is understand that just because you understand, say, Java, does not mean you understand using Java for automating mobile applications. I do recommend working with a services partner for some training that has experience with it. It's not the easiest thing in the whole wide world to set up. That's part of the reason we've embedded it in our solution, so we can take some of that pain away from the user base. But I, would recommend looking out there in the ecosystem for training partners, working with folks like Checkpoint to get some help on getting started with it, because it's a little tricky to set up, and unfortunately, like a lot of open source things, it's not all that well documented. So work with folks like us. We take over some Appium expertise in making it work with our device cloud. Work with your services partners to learn a little bit about it. But, understand that you're not moving from A to B just by going from Selenium to Appium. You need to learn about it. You've got to go research it. You have to go out there and understand it.
Excellent. Great job, guys. So before we close out today, I just wanted to say thank you to Dan, McFall, and everyone in Mobile Labs for being a part of this webinar with us. Also, we do encourage everyone here to take the very short survey at the end of this webinar, letting us know how we did. Your feedback is very important to us. There's also some suggestions for future webinars you'd like for us to do. So with that, on behalf of everyone here at Checkpoint Technologies and everyone at Mobile Labs, we hope you enjoyed our webinar, and we hope you really have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Brent, and thank you, everybody who attended.